The laboratory hummed with a low, insistent whisper, the sound of machines that had grown accustomed to holding secrets too dangerous for daylight. Bruce Banner stood at the center of it all, the pale glow of monitors casting long shadows across his tired face. He had spent years searching for this moment, and now that it had finally arrived, he found himself unable to feel anything resembling triumph. There was only the quiet, familiar dread that had followed him across continents and through countless sleepless nights, the sense that whatever waited on the other side of this experiment would be neither mercy nor freedom, but something far stranger. He adjusted the final calibration with hands that refused to tremble, though his heart betrayed him. Around him, the gamma chamber pulsed with a soft emerald light, its rhythm matching the beating in his chest. He had convinced himself that this time would be different. This time, he would separate the man from the monster, the scientist from the storm. This time, he would finally be alone inside his own skin. He did not notice at first the way the light began to bend. The green glow deepened into something older, something that did not belong to any spectrum he had catalogued. A hairline crack appeared in the air itself, thin as a whispered prayer, and from that crack came a sound like the distant tearing of silk. Bruce turned toward it, and for one long, breathless moment he understood that he had made a terrible mistake. The explosion was not fire. It was not even light. It was absence, a sudden hollowing of the world, as though reality had inhaled sharply and forgotten to exhale. The laboratory folded inward. Steel became mist. Concrete became memory. And in the heart of that collapsing geometry, something enormous stirred, something that had been waiting a very long time to be born again. He awoke beneath a sky he did not recognize. The clouds were wrong. They moved too slowly, or perhaps too quickly, as though the air itself obeyed different laws here. He lay in a crater the size of a small town, his massive green shoulders steaming, the earth around him blackened and glassy. The Hulk sat up, and the ground groaned beneath his weight. He looked at his hands, and behind those enormous eyes, somewhere buried deep, Bruce Banner blinked in silent horror. Miles of forest lay flattened around him, trees splayed outward like the petals of some monstrous flower. Somewhere in the distance, a river had reversed its course, water climbing backward over stones. Birds circled without landing. The world felt held in a long, uncertain breath. Far above, satellites recorded everything. In sterile rooms scattered across the globe, analysts stared at their screens with expressions that could not quite decide between disbelief and terror. A green figure, humanoid, enormous, surviving atmospheric re-entry without a suit, without a ship, without any known mechanism of arrival. The footage looped again and again, and each time it seemed less possible than before. In a shadowed room lined with monitors, Cecil Stedman watched the feed with narrowed eyes. He had seen many impossible things in his career. He had cataloged them, filed them, occasionally befriended them. But this was different. This carried the weight of something that should not be here, something that had arrived through a door that should not exist. He reached for a red telephone with the calm of a man who had rehearsed the gesture for decades, and he began the quiet work of preparing his world for a war it did not yet know was coming. Elite agents were already moving. Helicopters lifted from hidden bases, their rotors slicing through the pale morning air. Ground teams advanced through the ruined forest with weapons that had never been publicly acknowledged. They did not speak as they approached. They had been trained not to. High above the clouds, another figure watched. Omni-Man hovered in perfect stillness, his crimson cape unmoving despite the wind, his eyes fixed on the crater below with the still, patient attention of a predator studying something new. He had crossed galaxies. He had ended civilizations with a single afternoon of work. And yet, watching this creature rise from the ruined earth, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. It was not fear. Fear was a small thing, and Nolan Grayson had grown too vast to house it. But it was cousin to fear, a distant relative that spoke the same language. Curiosity sharpened into caution. Below, the Hulk stumbled forward. For a moment, something like clarity passed across those enormous features. Bruce Banner surfaced briefly, a swimmer breaking the skin of a dark ocean, and he looked at the devastation around him with the exhausted grief of a man who had seen this scene too many times. He tried to speak. The word that came out was not a word. It was a rumble, low and mournful, the sound of a mountain remembering it was once a man. He began to walk, searching for anything that resembled civilization, hoping to find a road, a voice, a reason. But every step he took shook the ground, and every effort to push the Hulk back only seemed to draw the beast closer to the surface. The more he resisted, the stronger the other became. It had always been this way. It would always be this way. Across the world, in newsrooms and government bunkers, the same word began to circulate in hushed, disbelieving tones. Invasion. Screens filled with grainy footage of the green giant walking through the wreckage of a forest that no longer existed. Commentators spoke of aliens, of gods, of the end of things. Prayers were whispered in languages older than any nation. And then, from the pale morning sky, a red figure began to descend. Slowly at first, almost gently, as though the man falling from heaven wished to give the creature below one final moment of peace before the reckoning began. The Hulk raised his eyes. Somewhere inside him, Bruce Banner recognized the shape of trouble arriving on schedule. Two forces prepared to meet for the first time, and the world held its breath. Omni-Man landed with the quiet grace of something that had learned, over centuries, that noise was a luxury reserved for the weak. His boots touched the scorched earth without disturbing it, and for a long moment he simply studied the creature before him. The Hulk stood at the edge of the crater, chest heaving, eyes narrowed, waiting. Neither spoke. There was no need. The language between them had already been written in the language of gravity, in the way the air itself seemed to lean toward whichever of them might move first. Nolan Grayson had faced many things across his long life. He had fought warriors carved from starlight, beasts that fed on gravity, tyrants who wore the skin of gods. He had learned, over centuries of quiet conquest, that every living thing had a breaking point, a threshold beyond which resistance became impossible. He had never met a creature who did not possess one. He had never expected to. He spoke first, his voice calm, almost bored. He asked the creature what it was, where it had come from, whether it understood the words being offered to it. The Hulk answered by tearing a boulder from the earth and hurling it with such force that the air behind it caught fire. Omni-Man tilted his head, allowed the boulder to strike him, and did not move. Then he moved. The first blow shattered the sound barrier before it landed. The Hulk was driven backward through 3 mountains, each one folding around him like paper, before he came to rest inside the 4th. Omni-Man followed at a leisurely pace, expecting to find a corpse. He found instead a creature climbing out of the stone, larger somehow, angrier, its skin darkening to a deeper shade of green. The Hulk roared, and the sound rolled across the continent like the voice of something the world had forgotten how to name. They collided in the sky. They collided in the sea. They collided along the spine of a mountain range that had stood since before mammals walked the earth, and by the time they were finished with it, the range no longer existed. Every blow the Hulk absorbed seemed to feed him. Every fracture in his bones knit back thicker. Every scream of pain became a promise of greater strength. Omni-Man began to notice, and Omni-Man was not a man accustomed to noticing. He struck harder. The Hulk struck harder still. He flew faster. The Hulk caught him mid-flight and drove him into the ocean floor with such violence that a new trench opened in the crust of the world. Fish that had never seen sunlight found themselves suddenly airborne. Whales sang songs they had never sung before, and still the green giant kept coming. For the first time in centuries, Nolan Grayson felt the edges of something unfamiliar pressing against his certainty. He had been the storm for so long that he had forgotten what it was to stand inside one. His fists ached, his breath came shorter, and every time he looked into the eyes of the creature before him, he saw not fear, not calculation, not even hatred, but a pure and terrible refusal. This being would not stop. This being could not stop. This being had made an art of not stopping. Far above, in a room lit only by monitors, the Global Defense Agency watched in stunned silence. Cecil Stedman had ordered the feeds recorded from a dozen angles, and each angle told the same impossible story. The strongest being on Earth was being matched. Not defeated, not yet, but matched, blow for blow, by something that had fallen out of the sky less than an hour ago. Analysts began to whisper. Cecil did not. He simply watched, and behind his eyes something was already being recalculated. On a rooftop many miles from the battle, a young man in blue and yellow stood frozen, his cape rippling in a wind that carried the distant thunder of impossible things. Mark Grayson had come to help. He had come because his father was fighting, and because the world was shaking, and because that was what heroes did. But he did not move. He could not. He watched the green creature take a blow that should have shattered a planet, and he watched that creature rise again, and something inside him shifted in a way he did not yet have words for. He had spent his young life believing that strength was the ability to end things. Watching the Hulk refuse to end, watching him rise again and again with nothing but pain and will to fuel him, Mark began to understand that there might be another definition, one he had not been taught, one his father had never spoken of. Below, the battle slowed, not because either combatant had weakened, but because something in the Hulk had begun to change. A tremor passed through those enormous shoulders. The green faded just slightly at the edges. Bruce Banner, buried deep beneath layers of rage, had heard something. A child crying, perhaps. A voice on the wind. Whatever it was, it reached him, and he reached back. And for one impossible moment, the Hulk stopped. He lowered his fists. He looked at Omni-Man with eyes that were, briefly, almost human. And he said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Nolan Grayson hovered in the air, blood on his lip, his cape torn, his certainty quietly rearranging itself. He had come expecting a monster. He had found something else, something he did not yet understand, something he suspected he would need to understand. And soon, he did not finish the fight. He turned instead, without a word, and rose into the clouds, leaving the green giant standing alone in the ruin of what had once been a coastline. It was not mercy. Nolan Grayson did not deal in mercy. It was patience. It was the recognition that some creatures could not be killed by the first attempt, and that any attempt not fully committed would only make the second attempt harder. Far above the atmosphere, in the cold silence between stars, other eyes were watching. Viltrumite scouts, dispatched on distant patrols, had detected the tremor of the battle from systems away. They logged the readings. They marked the coordinates. They sent word home. The echoes of the fight were spreading beyond Earth, and warriors older than empires had begun to listen. Bruce Banner awoke in a bed that was not his own, in a room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, and for a long moment he did not move. He had learned, over many years, that the first breath after transformation was the most dangerous. It was the breath in which he remembered what he had done, and what he had failed to prevent, and what the world would ask of him now. He lay very still, and he listened. A young voice was speaking somewhere down the hall. It was arguing gently with an older one. The older voice was tired, patient, edged with the kind of exhaustion that belonged to men who had watched too many decades pass without rest. Cecil Stedman, Bruce guessed. The younger voice, warmer and more uncertain, belonged to the boy in blue and yellow who had watched him from the rooftop. He sat up. His clothes were unfamiliar, borrowed, too large in some places, and too small in others. On the bedside table sat a note, written in careful handwriting. It welcomed him. It apologized for the restraints, which he now noticed had been removed. It invited him, when he was ready, to join the others for a meal. He did not know how long it had been since anyone had invited him to a meal. The teen team was smaller than he had expected, and younger and louder. They watched him with the wide, careful eyes of children who had been told a story about a monster, and were now discovering, with some disappointment, that the monster looked like a tired man in an oversized sweater. Robot spoke first, extending a mechanical hand with the courtesy of a diplomat. Rex made a joke that no one laughed at, and then another that a few people did. Eve smiled, and there was something in her smile that reminded Bruce of a garden he had once walked through, a very long time ago, before everything. Mark Grayson stood at the edge of the room, uncertain. He had questions he did not yet know how to ask. Bruce saw them in his eyes and did not press. The Guardians of the Globe were harder. They were older, and they had seen more, and they did not trust easily. But they were fair, and they listened. And when Bruce spoke of gamma radiation and dimensional fractures and the accident that had brought him here, they nodded slowly, and they did not interrupt. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Then someone offered him more coffee, and someone else asked whether he would be willing to help. He said yes before he understood what he had agreed to. The laboratory Cecil provided him was better than any he had ever worked in. The equipment was strange, subtly different from what he was accustomed to, but the principles were the same. He spent his days measuring, calculating, searching for the frequency of the fracture that had brought him here, hoping that somewhere in the numbers he might find a way home. He spent his evenings walking through the city, learning its rhythms, watching its people. They did not know who he was. They did not flinch when he passed. It was, he realized with quiet astonishment, the closest thing to peace he had felt in years. Mark visited often. At first he came with questions, and Bruce answered them as honestly as he could. Then he came with problems, small ones at first, then larger. A villain who could not be reasoned with, a friend who had grown distant, a father who had begun to feel like a stranger. Bruce listened. He did not offer wisdom he did not possess. He offered only the kind of attention that a young man rarely receives from anyone who is not obligated to give it. Something began to grow between them. It was not friendship exactly, though it resembled one. It was closer to the quiet mentorship of two men who had each carried more than they should have, and who recognized the shape of the weight in one another. Elsewhere, in rooms Bruce did not know existed, Omni-Men reviewed footage of the battle over and over again. He watched the moment the Hulk had stopped himself. He studied the shift in those green eyes. He calculated, with the cold precision of a man who had spent centuries calculating, what such a creature might be worth to an empire that had never encountered his equal. He did not share his conclusions. He filed them away, and he waited. Farther still, in a hall carved from the bones of a dead moon, another figure received a report. Thrag, Grand Regent of the Viltrum Empire, listened without expression as his scouts described what they had witnessed. A creature that grew stronger with every wound. A being whose ceiling could not be measured. A warrior who had matched Nolan Grayson blow for blow and walked away. Thrag did not speak for a long time after the report ended. When he finally did, his voice was quiet, and it was terrible. He wanted the creature found. He wanted the creature studied. And if the creature could be recruited, he wanted the creature standing at his side. If it could not, he wanted it destroyed, along with the world that had sheltered it. He did not know, yet, that the same creature was at that moment sitting in a small kitchen in a small apartment, listening to a young hero named Mark Grayson describe, with hesitant honesty, the growing distance between himself and his father. Bruce Banner poured another cup of coffee. He did not offer advice. He only listened, and he nodded, and he understood. Outside the window, the city glowed with the ordinary lights of an ordinary evening. Somewhere in the distance, a train sounded its horn. A dog barked. A child laughed. Bruce closed his eyes and allowed himself, for just a moment, to believe that he had found something he had never expected to find again. He did not know that the stars above the city were already beginning to shift. He did not know that ships older than nations were already turning in his direction. He only knew that, for the first time in a very long time, he was not afraid to be still. The darkness, when it came, would come from above. They came at dawn because dawn was the hour when hope was thinnest and cities were slowest to wake. There were 7 of them, and they did not announce themselves. They simply arrived, descending through the atmosphere in silent formation, their crimson and white uniforms cutting the sky like the blades of an ancient ceremony. They had been chosen for this mission because they were the finest the Empire could spare, and because Thrag had made clear that failure would be repaid in ways that even Viltrumites feared to imagine. Their orders were precise. Locate the green creature. Extend the offer. If the offer was accepted, escort him to the Empire with all honors due to a warrior of his stature. If the offer was refused, reduce the planet to a memory and take whatever was left of him home in a container. They did not expect the refusal to matter. They had been told the creature was strong. They had not been told what strength meant in this case. The first city fell in under a minute, not because the Viltrumites wished to destroy it, but because they had chosen to land in its center as a demonstration. Buildings collapsed in the shockwave of their arrival. Cars lifted from the streets and did not come down where they had risen. People ran and screamed and prayed, and the Viltrumites watched them run with the mild interest of scholars observing insects. Then the Hulk arrived. He did not fly. He leaped, and the leap alone shattered every window within a mile. He landed between the Viltrumites and the fleeing crowd, and he did not roar, not at first. He simply stood, and he looked at them, and something in his eyes made even Viltrumite warriors pause. The lead scout stepped forward. He spoke in the measured tones of a diplomat, offering the creature a place among the strongest beings in the galaxy, an eternity of purpose, a war that would never end. The Hulk listened. He waited until the scout had finished. Then he took the scout by the throat and drove him through the pavement, through the sewer beneath it, through the bedrock beneath that, and did not stop until they had traveled through half a continent. The battle that followed did not resemble a battle. It resembled a storm. Mark arrived within minutes, the Guardians shortly after. They fought bravely, but the Viltrumites were older, faster, more precise. Immortal was thrown through a mountain. Black Samson caught a punch that would have killed a lesser man and used the moment to strike back, though the strike did little more than announce his presence. Rex improvised as he always did, with explosives and jokes and a kind of desperate ingenuity that bought his teammates seconds when they needed minutes. Mark fought his first true war that day. He learned in the space of an afternoon how much pain a body could endure before it stopped being a body. He learned how quickly a friend could fall. He learned the taste of his own blood, and the sound of a scream that came from his own throat without his permission. And through all of it, the Hulk fought beside him. Every wound the green giant took made him larger. Every blow he absorbed came back doubled. The Viltrumites, who had been trained to view all opponents as puzzles to be solved through sufficient application of force, discovered that this puzzle rearranged itself with every attempt. The angrier the Hulk grew, the stronger he became. The stronger he became, the angrier he grew. There was no ceiling. There was no floor. There was only the slow, terrible realization spreading from warrior to warrior across the battlefield that they had been sent to catch something that could not be caught. One by one, they fell. Not killed, most of them, because the Hulk had learned, in his years, that killing was rarely the point, but broken and scattered and left in craters they would not soon climb out of. The lead scout, when the Hulk finally released him, could no longer stand. He looked up at the green giant with an expression that was not quite fear, because Viltrumites did not fear, but was close enough that the difference no longer mattered. Above the atmosphere, Thrag received the reports in real time. He watched the feeds. He listened to the panicked transmissions. He said nothing for a very long time, and when he finally spoke, it was not to condemn his warriors, but to reconsider his strategy. He had seen in the footage something he had not expected. He had seen the Hulk shield a child with his own body. He had seen the Hulk pause, mid-strike, to redirect a falling piece of debris away from a fleeing civilian. He had seen the Hulk fight not for glory, not for conquest, not for the pure joy of destruction that Viltrumites had been bred to feel, but for something older and stranger and infinitely more useful. The creature protected. That was the key. That was the lever. That was the weakness he could exploit. If force could not compel him, perhaps care could. If care could not compel him, perhaps care could be turned against him. Every heart that beat with love beat also with fear, and fear was a currency Thrag had spent an empire to master. He gave new orders. The warriors who could still fly were to withdraw. The ones who could not were to be left where they had fallen, as messages. And a ship was to be prepared, small enough to seem unthreatening, ornate enough to communicate respect. Thrag would come himself. He would speak to the man inside the monster. He would offer, in his own voice, the things that empires had learned no warrior could refuse. Below, on a ruined street beneath a smoke-darkened sky, Bruce Banner returned to himself slowly. He knelt beside a wounded child, and he pressed his enormous green hand against a wound he was too large to properly tend, and he made a sound that no one who heard it would ever forget. It was not a roar. It was not a cry. It was closer to a prayer, the kind that men make when they have run out of gods to address. Mark knelt beside him and did not speak, and did not need to. Somewhere above the clouds, an ornate ship began its descent. The ship touched down in an open field beyond the ruined city, and it did so without a single blade of grass bending out of its way. Thrag emerged alone. He wore no armor. He carried no weapon. He walked across the field with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never, in the course of a very long life, been asked to hurry. Bruce Banner, waiting at the edge of the field in the borrowed clothes of a borrowed world, watched him come. They had agreed to meet without escorts. Mark had objected. The Guardians had objected. Cecil had objected loudest of all. But Bruce had insisted, because he understood, in a way the others did not. that some conversations could only happen between two men who were each capable of ending the world. Any third party would only be a hostage, and hostages made honesty impossible. Thragg stopped a respectful distance away. He inclined his head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. He introduced himself in the old style, with the formal cadences of an empire that had once considered courtesy a form of warfare. Bruce introduced himself in return more simply, because he had never learned any other way. They walked. Thragg did not offer his hand, and Bruce did not offer his, and neither man mentioned the omission. They walked past the ruined edge of the field and into a small grove of trees that had somehow survived the morning's violence, and there, beneath a canopy of leaves that trembled in a wind neither of them could feel, Thragg made his offer. He spoke of peace. He spoke of a galaxy in which the Hulk would never again be hunted, in which Bruce Banner would never again wake in a crater not knowing what he had done. He spoke of laboratories the size of moons, of scientists who had spent lifetimes studying gamma radiation, of a cure that the Empire had already begun to develop in anticipation of this very meeting. He spoke of purpose, and he spoke of it with the quiet conviction of a man who had spent centuries watching lesser men die for lack of it. Bruce listened. He did not interrupt. He did not scoff. He was too tired and too honest to pretend that the words did not touch him. He had spent his adult life running from the thing inside him. He had spent his adult life dreaming of the day when he might set it down. Thragg was offering him that day, wrapped in ceremony, delivered on a silver tongue that had never learned to lie clumsily. Inside him, the Hulk stirred. The other did not speak in words. He never had. But Bruce had learned, over the years, to read the shape of his moods, and the shape of this one was unmistakable. The Hulk did not trust the man in the grove. The Hulk had seen creatures like Thragg before, in the deep places of Bruce's memory, and he had learned to recognize the smell of them. They came with soft voices. They came with gifts. They came with words that fit too neatly into the wounds a man had spent his life trying to hide, and when they left, they took more than they had given. Bruce felt the divide inside him widen. Part of him wanted to accept, part of him already had, and part of him, the greenest part, the part that had once been ashamed of itself and had only lately begun to understand that shame had been the wrong response, refused loudly, refused with the whole of its enormous aching being. He asked Thragg a question. He asked what would happen to Earth if he accepted. Thragg smiled, and the smile was almost kind. He said that Earth would be spared, of course. He said that Earth would be welcomed into the Empire as a protected territory, that its people would be uplifted, that its wars would end. He said all the right things, in all the right orders, and Bruce listened, and Bruce heard, beneath the words, the sound of a promise that had never once been kept. He said no. He said it quietly. He said it without anger. He said it the way a man says goodbye to a life he has loved and will never return to. Thragg nodded as though he had expected the answer, and perhaps he had. He turned, and he walked back toward his ship, and he did not look back. Meanwhile, far above the grove, Omni-Man hovered in silent observation. He had followed Thragg without permission because he had begun, in recent weeks, to do many things without permission. He had watched the meeting from a distance too great for either man to detect him, and he had heard, through instruments no human possessed, every word of the exchange. He had come expecting to be reassured. He had come expecting to see the old order reaffirmed. Instead, he had seen a man refuse the Empire, and he had felt, in the pit of a chest that had not felt anything in centuries, the small, dangerous stirring of doubt. He thought of his son. He thought of the world below, and the small lives that filled it, and the way the Hulk had knelt beside a wounded child in the rubble of a city he had not been born on. He thought of many things, and he did not yet know what to do with any of them. Below, in an apartment lit by the golden light of a late afternoon, Mark Grayson waited for Bruce to return. When Bruce arrived and sat down and accepted a cup of coffee with hands that were still, somehow, human, Mark did not ask what had happened. He simply sat with him. And Bruce, looking across the small table at the young man who had become, without either of them intending it, something closer to a son than a friend, felt the strange and unfamiliar warmth of being trusted. Above the atmosphere, an armada began to gather. Thragg had spoken his last words of diplomacy. The next words would be spoken in fire. The first wave crossed the atmosphere in silence, because silence was the doctrine of the Viltrum Empire in the moments before slaughter. 10,000 warriors, arranged in formations older than most civilizations, descended toward Earth in perfect columns. They did not shout. They did not gesture. They came down like rain, and the rain was made of soldiers, and each soldier could level a city without breathing hard. Earth met them with everything it had. The Global Defense Agency scrambled every asset in its arsenal. Cecil Stedman, sitting in a command bunker beneath a mountain no one was supposed to know existed, coordinated a defense that had been planned for decades and had never, until this moment, been believed possible. Reanimated soldiers rose from stasis. Ancient weapons were unsealed from vaults that had been welded shut in Bruce's grandfather's youth. Every hero on the planet, everyone who could still stand, converged on the coordinates where the first Viltrumites were touching down. The guardians of the globe fought as they had never fought before. Immortal, who had lived 1,000 years, discovered that 1,000 years had been merely preparation for this afternoon. Black Samson found reserves of strength he had thought long since spent. Rex made his last joke of the morning and did not survive to hear whether anyone had laughed, though his sacrifice bought the line 30 seconds that would later be measured in continents saved. Mark fought at the head of the young heroes, and he was no longer the boy who had stood on a rooftop watching a battle he could not join. He had grown in the weeks since the Hulk had arrived, in ways he could not have grown alone. He fought with a discipline his father had never taught him, because his father had never possessed it. He fought with a purpose Bruce had shown him, quietly, across 100 small conversations. He fought for the people below him, and he did not once forget that they were the reason for any of it. And beside him, above him, beneath him, everywhere the fighting was thickest, moved the Hulk. Something had changed in Bruce Banner during the quiet weeks in the small apartment. He had spent years believing that the Hulk was a curse, a punishment, a mistake to be undone. He had spent years hiding and running and hating the green thing that lived inside his ribs. But somewhere in those weeks, sitting across from Mark Grayson, listening to a young man describe the shape of his own fears, Bruce had begun to understand something he had refused to see for a very long time. The Hulk was not his punishment. The Hulk was the part of him that had refused to die when everything in his life had asked him to. The Hulk was not the enemy. The Hulk was the survival. When he transformed on the battlefield that morning, he did not lose himself. He did not have to. For the first time, Bruce Banner walked into the green with his eyes open, and the green welcomed him. And the two of them, at last, were one. The result was a strength the universe had not previously catalogued. Viltrumites who had ended civilizations found themselves unable to close the distance. Warriors who had trained for centuries in the arts of combat discovered that their training had prepared them for opponents whose limits could be measured. The Hulk had no limits. He grew as the battle grew. He answered every escalation with an escalation of his own. When they came at him in 2s, he became strong enough for 3s. When they came at him in 5s, he became strong enough for 10s. There was no formula for him. There was no counter. There was only the terrible, escalating fact of him, growing larger with every passing minute of the war. Omni-Man fought beside his son. He had made his choice quietly, in the days after the Grove. He had not announced it. He had not written it down. He had simply, when the first ships came, taken his place in the sky above the Guardians, and struck the first blow against his own kind. Mark saw him. Mark did not have words for what he felt. He would find them later, in a quieter room. For now he only fought, and his father fought beside him, and the sight of the two of them together, in the sky above a burning coast, would become one of the images the survivors carried for the rest of their lives. The war spread. It spread beyond Earth. It spread to the moon, where a Viltrumite outpost had been established in secret, and the outpost did not survive the day. It spread to Mars, where reinforcements had gathered, and Mars became, in the span of 6 hours, a place no living Viltrumite would willingly visit again. It spread through the asteroid belt, where the ships of the Empire had planned to stage their final assault, and by nightfall, the belt was quieter than it had been since the birth of the solar system. The Hulk moved through all of it. He did not tire. He could not. Every wound he took became fuel. Every blow that struck him became a promise of the blow he would return. Warriors who had lived for 1,000 years fell before him, and they fell not because he hated them, but because he was, at last, no longer afraid of what he was. By the time the sun set on the first day of the Green War, 3 Viltrumite champions lay defeated in 3 different corners of the solar system. The Empire had not lost a single champion in 100 years. To lose 3 in a single day was not merely a defeat, it was a rewriting of the natural order. In the hall carved from the bones of a dead moon, Thrag received the news without expression. He stood for a long time in the silence of his chamber. He looked at a wall on which he had, centuries ago, carved the names of every warrior he had ever personally killed. The wall was long. He had, over the years, grown proud of its length. Tonight, for the first time, he did not look at it with pride. He looked at it with the calm assessment of a man who was preparing to add a name he had not, until this morning, believed he would need to. He reached for his own armor. He had not worn it in over a century. It fit him still. It always would. Only one warrior remained who could yet decide the fate of 2 universes, and that warrior was preparing, in silence, to descend. Thrag came without ceremony, because ceremony was for men who wished to be watched, and he had come to work. He crossed the solar system in a single arc, a red streak against the black, and when he entered Earth's atmosphere, he did not slow. He struck the ground beside the Hulk with the force of a small moon, and the impact opened a canyon that would later be given a new name, because the old maps no longer applied. The Hulk rose from the crater beside him. They did not speak. Words had been spent in the grove weeks earlier. What remained now was older than language. The first exchange lasted less than a second, and in that second they crossed 100 miles. The second lasted less than that, and they crossed 1,000. By the time the third exchange ended, they had left the atmosphere behind, and they were fighting in the black between worlds, and the stars themselves seemed to bend slightly around the violence of them. Thrag fought as no Viltrumite before him had ever fought. He had spent centuries perfecting a martial art that had no name, because he was its only practitioner. Every movement was economical. Every strike was placed. He did not waste breath. He did not waste motion. He struck the Hulk with combinations that would have folded lesser opponents into their own shadows, and the Hulk received them, and the Hulk answered. The first moon they passed through cracked, the second shattered. By the time they reached the asteroid belt, they were leaving a trail of debris behind them that would take millennia to settle. Thrag drove the Hulk through the core of a mining planet, and the planet became, in the space of a heartbeat, an expanding ring of rubble. The Hulk drove Thrag back the way they had come, and the ring parted before them, and closed behind them, and forgot that it had ever been anything else. Somewhere in the middle of it, Thrag began to understand. He had been told the creature grew stronger with anger. He had planned for that. He had trained for it. He had brought techniques designed to deprive the Hulk of the momentum that fed him. But those techniques required an opponent who fought only from anger. Thrag had prepared for a beast. He had come, instead, to face a man. The Hulk did not fight from anger alone. Not anymore. He fought from something older and steadier, and infinitely more difficult to interrupt. He fought from love. He fought for the young hero he had come to see as a son. He fought for the small apartment where he had learned to sit still. He fought for a wounded child he had cradled in an enormous green hand and made a sound over that he still, weeks later, did not have words for. And because he fought from love, he did not tire. Anger burned itself out. Love did not. Love found new fuel in every reason to continue. Thrag struck him with a blow that would have shattered a dwarf star. The Hulk caught it. Thrag struck him again, harder, with a combination that had never failed in 3 centuries of use, to end a fight. The Hulk let it land, absorbed the damage, grew larger, and returned the strike with such force that Thrag was driven backward through the wreckage of a moon and into the surface of a gas giant, where the pressure of the atmosphere alone should have crushed a lesser Viltrumite into silence. Thrag rose from the pressure. He was not lesser, but he was also, for the first time in a century, uncertain, and uncertainty in a warrior of his stature was the first sign of an ending. They fought through the rings of Saturn, and the rings did not survive. They fought across the moons of Jupiter, and the moons acquired new craters that geologists would spend generations attempting to explain. They fought back toward Earth, and by the time they re-entered the atmosphere, both of them were bleeding in ways that neither of them had bled in a very long time. The Hulk had grown. He was larger now than he had been at the start of the fight. larger than he had been at the start of the war. He was reaching, in the course of a single afternoon, levels of power that neither universe had ever formally acknowledged as possible. The green of him had deepened. His eyes, when Thrag glimpsed them between exchanges, were not the eyes of a beast. They were the eyes of a man who had, at last, made peace with everything he was. Thrag tried, in the closing minutes of the battle, to speak. He tried to offer new terms. He tried to appeal to reason, to pragmatism, to the shared understanding of warriors who had walked the same lonely roads. The Hulk did not answer, not because he was too enraged to answer, because he had already answered, weeks ago, in a small grove of trees, and the answer had not changed. The final blow, when it came, was not dramatic. It was quiet. The Hulk simply closed the distance one final time, took Thrag by the shoulders, and drove him down into the crust of the earth with a force that the crust did not attempt to resist. The crust folded around him. The mantle received him. And when the Hulk stepped back, breathing hard, Thrag did not rise. He was not dead. The Hulk had not killed him. That, too, had been a choice, made somewhere in the middle of the fight, in a moment neither of them would speak of. Thrag lay in the crater he had made, and he looked up at the green giant who stood above him. And for the first time in the memory of any living being, the Grand Regent of the Viltrum Empire looked defeated. Above them, the fleet began to withdraw. There was no order given. There was no signal sent. The warriors of the Empire simply saw what had happened, and they understood, in the wordless way that warriors understand these things, that the war was over. They turned, and they left, and they did not look back. Mark Grayson landed beside Bruce Banner as the last of the ships disappeared into the black. He did not speak. Bruce did not speak. They stood together in the ruin of a battlefield that would take a generation to heal, and they watched the sky, and they knew, both of them, that something had ended. They did not yet know what it had cost. The Rift was the first to speak of what had been paid. It began, in the days after the battle, as a hairline shimmer above the ruined coast where the Hulk had first arrived. At first, the scientists who monitored it assumed it was residual radiation, an aftershock of the violence that had opened it weeks before. Then the shimmer widened. Then it began to pulse. Then it began to hum, at a frequency that made instruments fail and dogs weep and children wake from dreams they could not remember. Bruce Banner arrived at the site on the third day, and he knew, before any measurement was taken, what he was looking at. He had felt this hum before. He had felt it in the seconds before his laboratory collapsed, in the moments before he had awoken on this strange and welcoming earth. The rift was not closing. The rift was widening, and the gamma energy that had opened it, held in unstable suspension across the fabric of two universes, was beginning to bleed. He worked for 4 days without sleep. Cecil provided him with everything he asked for and much that he did not. The Guardians rotated through the laboratory in shifts, offering what help they could. Mark came and stayed and did not leave, and did not ask questions Bruce did not have answers for. On the 5th day, Bruce set down his instruments, and he looked at the numbers on his screen for a long time, and he understood. The rift would consume both universes, not in years, not in months, in weeks. The gamma energy that fueled it had reached a critical resonance, and the only thing in either universe that resonated at that frequency was the Hulk himself. He was the anchor. He was the tuning fork. And the fracture would not close until the anchor was returned to it, and the tuning fork was silenced, and the frequency was allowed to unwind into nothing. He did not tell Mark at first. He wanted, selfishly, another day of not saying it aloud. He gave himself that day. He spent it in the small apartment, sitting across from a young man who had, over the course of a few months, become the closest thing to family he had known in years. They ate a meal Bruce had cooked poorly. They watched a film Mark had chosen. They spoke of nothing important because Bruce could not yet speak of what was important, and Mark could see that, and Mark, with the grace that had grown in him during the weeks of quiet mentorship, did not press. On the 6th day, Bruce told them. The room was very quiet when he finished. Cecil, who had spent his life responding to crises with the calm of a man who had already imagined every possible one, could not immediately speak. Nolan, who had arrived at the meeting without being invited and had not been asked to leave, stared at the floor with an expression that no one present had ever seen on him before. Mark stood at the far end of the table, and his hands were shaking, and he did not try to hide it. They looked for another way. They looked for hours. They looked for days. They pulled in every scientist Earth possessed and several from other worlds. They ran calculations. They ran simulations. They ran themselves in shifts into the ground. And at the end of it, when the sun rose on the 9th day of the crisis, they had not found another way. There was not another way. The universe had asked its question, and it had provided only one answer. Bruce accepted it before anyone else did. He had, perhaps, accepted it from the moment he first felt the hum. He had spent his entire adult life expecting to be asked, someday, to pay for the accident that had made him what he was. He had not expected the payment to feel like this. He had expected it to feel like a punishment. It did not. It felt like a gift offered in a language he had only recently learned to speak. He gathered them on the 10th day at the edge of the rift. Mark was there. Nolan was there. Cecil was there. The Guardians stood in a loose semicircle, and behind them stood a small crowd of people who had come without being asked, because they had heard, and because they had understood, and because they had wanted, in whatever small way, to be present. Bruce spoke briefly. He was not a man given to speeches, and he did not attempt one now. He thanked them. He thanked the world that had received him. He said that he had spent his life believing that the thing inside him was a curse, and that he had learned, in the months since arriving here, that the thing inside him had always been the part of him that refused to die. He said that he was not afraid. He said that he had been afraid for most of his life, and he had grown very tired of it. And this was the first thing in a long time that he was not afraid of. Then he turned to Mark. He did not say much. He did not need to. He put his hand on the young man's shoulder, and he held it there for a long moment, and then he stepped back. Mark did not try to stop him. He had learned from Bruce that some doors could only be walked through by the person they had been made for. Bruce Banner walked to the edge of the rift. He transformed one last time, and the transformation was different from any that had come before. He did not shrink. He did not scream. He simply grew and grew and grew, and the green of him deepened into something that no artist could later render accurately. He looked at the crowd. He raised one enormous hand in something that was almost a wave, and then he stepped into the fracture. The rift consumed him. The hum quieted. The shimmer collapsed inward, folding itself down into a single point of light no larger than a coin. The point of light hung in the air for one long moment, and then, quietly, it was gone. The sky above the ruined coast was, at last, still. Mark Grayson stood in the silence with his father beside him. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The world had been saved. The cost had been paid. And somewhere in a place neither of them could follow, a man who had spent his life carrying a monster had, at last, set the monster down. Months passed because months always pass whether the world is ready for them or not. The seasons turned. The cities rebuilt. The craters filled in slowly or were left as they were, because some scars deserved to be remembered. The Global Defense Agency reorganized. The Guardians of the Globe accepted new members and mourned the ones who had not survived, and continued their work with the quiet persistence of people who had learned that grief and duty could occupy the same room without either of them speaking. The Viltrum Empire, in the wake of its defeat, did not immediately collapse. Empires rarely do, but something had broken in it that could not be repaired. The warriors who had returned from the Green War carried with them, back to their homeworlds, a story that spread faster than any decree could suppress. They spoke of a green giant who could not be broken. They spoke of a man inside the giant who had refused their empire not out of pride, but out of principle. They spoke, some of them, in whispers, of the sound the giant had made kneeling beside a wounded child. And in the telling of these stories, something older than the Empire began to stir among the warriors of Viltrum. Something the Empire had spent centuries trying to breed out of them. Doubt, wonder, the dangerous, contagious suspicion that there might be another way to live. Nolan Grayson never returned to the Empire. He had made his choice, quietly, on a morning above a grove of trees, and he did not unmake it. He stayed on Earth. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, to be a father in a way he had never before attempted. Mark did not forgive him at once. Some things cannot be forgiven at once. But Mark listened when his father spoke, and Nolan listened when his son did, and over the course of many long evenings the shape of something that could, one day, resemble a family began to emerge between them. Mark himself was changed. He fought differently now. He led differently. He had absorbed, without ever formally being taught, the lessons that Bruce Banner had offered him across a small kitchen table. He had learned that strength was not measured in the enemies you defeated. He had learned that it was measured in the friends you kept, and the strangers you protected, and the small, quiet moments in which you chose, again, to be kind when kindness was not required of you. He said this once, in a speech to the young heroes of the next generation, and afterward he was embarrassed by how earnest he had sounded, and later still he was glad he had said it anyway. Across the galaxy, the stories spread. On worlds that had never heard of Earth, warriors gathered around fires and spoke of the green giant who had fought an empire without seeking a throne. On worlds that had suffered under the boot of Viltrum for generations, the stories became something closer to prayer. Movements formed, rebellions rose. And though the green giant himself was gone, or believed to be gone, his shadow moved across the galaxy in ways that no living creature could have moved, opening doors that had been closed for centuries, giving hope to people who had forgotten the taste of it. On Earth, the Earth that had been Bruce Banner's own, in a laboratory that had been rebuilt out of the ruin of the one that had opened the rift, a young technician noticed something on her instruments one quiet morning. She stared at the reading for a long time. She called her supervisor. Her supervisor called his. By the end of the day, a small team of scientists stood around the instrument in question, and they looked at the number it was displaying, and they did not know what to make of it. It was a faint gamma reading, and it did not match anything in their catalogs, and it was pulsing, very slightly, at a frequency that no one present recognized. They filed a report. They archived the data. They did not yet know what it meant. Somewhere, in the endless folds of the multiverse, in a place that had no name in any known language, a man opened his eyes. He did not know, at first, where he was. He did not know how long it had been. He knew only that he was alive in some form, and that the thing inside him was alive as well, and that the two of them were, at last, one and the same. He rose. He looked around. He saw nothing he recognized, and everything he had ever hoped to find. He took his first step in a new world, and the world did not shake beneath him, because he had learned, at long last, how to walk gently. He was not the strongest in that new world because he could destroy it. He never had been. He was the strongest because, when all hope had been gone, he had chosen to endure. He was the strongest because he had carried the weight of two souls united by one purpose. He was the strongest because he had loved and had allowed himself to be loved, and had walked into a fracture in the sky rather than let the people who loved him pay for a mistake that had never truly been his. Across infinite realities, countless warriors had sought power to rule worlds. Only one had become stronger with every hardship. Only one had made of his curse a companion, and of his monster a friend, and of his rage a shield for the small and the trembling. He was not remembered in the end as the strongest because he could destroy. He was remembered as the strongest because he had chosen, when he could have chosen otherwise, to endure. On the Earth of the Invincible universe, Mark Grayson stood on a rooftop at dusk. The city glowed beneath him. Somewhere in the distance, a train sounded its horn. A dog barked. A child laughed. He listened to these small, ordinary sounds, and he smiled, and he did not know why. And he did not need to know. Above him, the stars came out, one by one, in the darkening sky. And somewhere very far away, at a frequency that no instrument on Earth could yet detect, a low and distant roar rolled outward through the folds of the multiverse. It was not a roar of anger. It was not a roar of pain. It was closer to a greeting, offered to whatever universe had received him, from a man who had, at last, learned how to be at peace with the storm that lived inside him. The legend was not finished. It was only beginning.